I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us a brand new guest. He's a multiple-time best-selling author of this book. It's fascinating. It's called All Out War. It is a plot to destroy Trump. We've been talking about that for ever since Donald Trump was elected. We're talking about Ed Klein. Ed Klein, the multiple best-selling author. Ed, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
It's pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you on. In your book, you made a lot of accusations. People should go out and buy this book. It's already another #1 bestseller. Your bestsellers, just recent bestsellers, are Guilty as Sin, Unlikable, Blood Feud, which is about the Clintons and the Obamas, Amateur, Blood Feud and The Amateur, both #1 best-selling books. This already another best-selling book. But in your book, you talk about, and I just want to start here, which is just an unbelievable source, in fact, that they have a meeting in December of 2016 at the White House, the Obamas, Valerie Jarrett, Susan Rice, and they hatched this plan to unmask all these people. That is just an unbelievable source. Tell me about how you came across that fact that started out this whole Russian collusion investigation.
Well, the plot actually, as you just said, did begin on December 16th at a dinner in the family quarters of the White House. Attending were, of course, the president, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Valerie Jarrett, their so-called consigliere, and a couple of other guests. And one of those other guests was my source. So this took place, as I say, about 6 weeks after the election of Donald Trump. He had not yet, of course, been inaugurated as president. And Susan Rice was invited to come to the dinner party and give the president a plan. And her plan was to unmask the names of Donald Trump associates who had been inadvertently picked up by electronic intercepts by the National Security Agency. Now, these names of these Americans were supposed to remain confidential, but she suggested they be unmasked, meaning they'd become public, that they'd be distributed widely throughout the intelligence community, and that inevitably, therefore, she admitted, those names would be leaked to the mainstream media, and the story would begin at that point that there was collusion between Donald Trump and the Russians, which of course was always a fairy tale, because now we have had an investigation going on for well over a year and a half, and no one has come up with a scintilla of evidence to prove that.
So what they did was just flat out broke the law. I mean, this reminds me of treason, sedition. Another reason why there's a big holdup to have Susan Rice testify in Congress, because anybody in Congress, the Senate or the House, would have to do if they get Susan Rice in front of them is to say, hey, Ed Klein's book right here says you guys hatched this plan on December 16th to unmask everything. That's all felony activity. I mean, don't they all go down in a ball of fire if this fully gets investigated by what now is a possible special prosecutor appointed by Jeff Sessions?
Well, that's a number of questions you're asking there. But let's start with Susan Rice. As the National Security Advisor, she had the right, by going to a foreign intelligence security court, to request that these names be unmasked and get the permission of a judge, which in fact she did get the permission of a judge to do those unmaskings. So she wasn't doing anything illegal, but clearly she was doing something unethical, to put it mildly, because the president, Obama, and his national security advisor were using the intelligence community as a weapon against their political enemy, Donald Trump.
Is it using the intelligence communities as a weapon? Isn't that illegal? I mean, you're not supposed to be using the CIA against U.S. citizens, right?
You're certainly not supposed to be, but that would be very hard to prove that they did anything illegal. And I honestly don't believe that there's going to be an investigation of Barack Obama, the former president. I do think there is, however, because you brought up Jeff Sessions, who, by the way, is testifying before Congress.
Yep.
That there's a lot of pressure on him to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate Hillary Clinton and her connections with the Russians in commissioning that famous or infamous Russian dossier that we all know about that accused Donald Trump of all kinds of sexual misconduct and collusion with the Russians, all of which has been, or almost all of which has been disproved as disinformation from the Russians. But we do know that she actually authorized that they purchase this dossier, and that she used campaign funds to pay her law firm to actually launder that money and use it to buy this dossier. And that's against the law, because you're supposed to acknowledge and publicize what your campaign funds are used for, and they're supposed to be used only for the campaign.
Which I think is the reason why Donna Brazile came out and was no, not going to happen. Do you think that this Uranium One deal could ensnare a lot of people? I mean, there was a well-known investigation run by Mueller. They knew there were Russian agents, spies, racketeering, all kinds of payoffs happening, trying to get at Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, trying to get control of a portion of our uranium production. They knew all this. So, and then they let the sale go through, Rosenstein, all that. Do you think that there's a wider investigation that could ensnare a lot of big people? Are your sources telling you that?
Well, there is a movement on the part of a number of Republicans in Congress to get Jeff Sessions and the Justice Department to open this investigation of what went on behind the scenes during this so-called Uranium One deal, in which America approved, while she was Secretary of State, the sale of 20% of our uranium production to the Russians. Simultaneously with that sale, or the steps that led up to that sale, $135 million in donations went into the coffers of the Clinton Foundation from sources who had something to gain from that sale. Plus, Bill Clinton was invited to Moscow to give a speech, as you well know, paid $500,000 for that speech from the bank that was financing the Uranium One deal, and then he met with Putin. Now, Bill Clinton was not supposed to go anywhere abroad and give speeches without the express approval of the State Department, which of course was run by his wife. So she had to approve the $500,000 fee that he got from the Russians during the negotiations on Uranium One. All of this, to use a phrase, stinks to high heaven, clearly indicates something corrupt was going on during this period of time. And that's why President Trump, Republicans in Congress, and a lot of other people are urging Jeff Sessions to open an investigation.
You know, we have in your book another fascinating. There's a lot of fascinating things in your book. You have FBI documents documenting that this relationship between Antifa and violence and things like that. Is that something that's going to be coming down the pipe that you think something you're predicting in your book? More violence, Antifa, social justice, communism, whatever it is. Do you think more of that is coming?
I do, and I think so does the FBI. The FBI report that I have reproduced in full in my book says that these violent left-wing groups traveled to Europe, met with representatives of al-Qaida and the Islamic State, ISIS, went to Syria, got bomb-making instructions, toxic chemical instructions. The FBI followed these people, has continued to follow them now that they're back in America, and believes that when the 2018 midterm elections come, things are going to get hotter and hotter in this country politically, and that these groups are going to become more and more violent. And the FBI has said in this document that I have in this new book that these left-wing groups like Antifa represent the greatest threat to law enforcement since the 1970s and the Weather Underground.
That's an awful big. They bomb buildings where they're on the ground.
That's right.
They kill people. You
They
think
did.
it's going to be bigger than that?
Well, I don't know. I would imagine, from what I've been told by my sources and from reading this document, the FBI is watching these violent groups as closely as they can, because they do represent a kind of homemade terrorist threat to our politics and to our communities. So these people are under surveillance. Whether we can stop these violent acts, whether the FBI can stop them in advance, we'll have to see when 2018 rolls around.
I left this out in your bio. I mean, but I shouldn't. I mean, you're a deep reporter, an investigative reporter. That you've done a lot of tons of reporting work. Gives people a ray of hope. Are we going to have some sort of a strike back from Donald Trump and from the forces of good here against these people trying to unseat him?
Well, I think that Donald Trump and the people around him are very conscious of the fact that there is a concerted effort on the part of Democrats to impeach him. And at this very moment, a guy named Tom Steyer, who is an extremist environmentalist billionaire, is spending $20 million of his own money to do TV ads calling for the impeachment of the president. On what basis, I don't know, because there is no basis for that. There are others in the base of the Democratic Party who feel that their greatest energizing issue is impeaching Donald Trump. So this is where the left-wing base gets its energy from, this hatred of the president. And they are devoid of, it seems to me, of any other ideas. And I think we're going to see this even get hotter as we move into the midterm elections. Meantime, the president and his administration has made tremendous progress in securing our southern border. Illegal immigration is down by 70%. We become much more energy independent because of regulations that the president has removed, and also approving the Keystone Pipeline. We should have tax reform, which will get this economy even humming better than already it has under him. He's at 3% now. He could go to 4 to 5%. And I think the president has made America a much more respected power around the world than it was certainly under Barack Obama. So the best way for the president to counter this plot to destroy him is through successful policies. And I think he is showing us that a lot of his policies are already making a good difference.
Do you think that part of his policies involve this whole human trafficking, whether it's adults or children or females for illicit activity? Do you think that, and this is not reported on very much in the press, the human trafficking aspect? I mean, they've arrested hundreds, if not thousands of people, and it's gotten a big yawn in the press. What do your sources say about the human trafficking issue behind the scenes?
Well, I don't have too many sources on that issue. I do know that when General Kelly, who is now the chief of staff, before he became the president's chief of staff, he was in charge of Homeland Security. And he had, as a Marine general, he was in charge of what was called the Southern Command of the U.S. military forces. And he was very much aware of the traffic that you're talking about in drugs and in human lives across our borders, and wanted desperately to do something about it. And when he became head of Homeland Security, he did. And now as chief of staff, he's doing something about it as well.
You know, I've heard you in other interviews talk about the people in New York. I lived up there for 10 years. I worked at CNN and I worked at ABC, Good Morning America. And, I pretty much kept my politics to myself. I wasn't really a Republican or a Democrat. But what I see going on now, I mean, all over the country, I hear reports of people losing friends over that you voted for Donald Trump, or you're not for Hillary, or you weren't for Hillary. I heard that you have lost friends. You've been up in New York City for a long time, and you got people that shun you. Would you talk about that a little bit? How divided the country is just on your small level and your connections in New York City?
Well, New York, of course, is a hotbed of liberalism, as you know. Went for Hillary Clinton by, I can't remember, 90 some odd percent, New York City and its environs. I, of course, as you know, used to be the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, and that was a long time ago. But when I was part and parcel of the media landscape here in New York. I knew practically everybody in the media, and I was treated with the kind of respect that we gave to each other. As soon as I started writing political books, long after I left the New York Times, especially my first book, which was called The Truth About Hillary, these so-called friends of mine in the media stopped talking to me, including when we would meet at restaurants or cross paths on the street. They'd ignore me. My wife and I were actually disinvited to parties because they didn't want me there because they disagreed with me. It is very interesting that the conservatives here in the New York area, which are, of course, in a minority, have no problems being friends with their liberal acquaintances. We conservatives seem to have an open mind about that. But the liberals think that if you don't agree with them, you are racist, you are homophobic, you are satanic, you're awful, and they don't want to have anything to do with you. They are very closed mind. These are the same people who talk about openness, but they're very, very closed in their politics.
I know you've had a storied career at the New York Times, the magazine. You were also editor at the New York Times too, weren't you? You were also at the paper, weren't you? Were you not?
No, I was the editor of the New York Times Magazine
only
for
the magazine. Okay.
11 years. Before that, I was the foreign editor of Newsweek magazine for about 12 years.
Yeah, you've got a storied career, and then one bestseller after another. I just your prediction on, do you think that they're going to be able to knock Donald Trump out of the box with what they're doing? I mean, it seems to me Mueller should step down immediately. I mean, you can't even have a hint of impropriety, and he is up to his neck in this whole Uranium One deal that he was overseeing an investigation on. Now he's looking for collusion with Donald Trump, probably the only guy that doesn't have collusion. Do you think that Mueller is going to be successful in knocking Trump out and getting this impeachment that everybody on the left wants?
Everybody on the left thinks he's going to be successful. Everybody thinks that since he's hired a stable of very well-known prosecutors, I think he's got 16 of them or 17 of them, very, very tough guys, that why would he do all this unless he thought he was going to get the brass ring, succeed in getting an indictment? I don't think he will. I don't think he will because I've known Donald Trump for 35 years. I traveled with him during the campaign. I know his wife. I've been to Mar-a-Lago, his estate down in Florida, been all over the place with him, talked to him countless times. I have no doubt that he is not in collusion never was in collusion with the Russians, and I don't think Mueller, for all his efforts, is ever going to prove that.
Do you think that Jeff Sessions would be successful against Hillary? Your sources, you've got to have sources. I don't know how many you're willing to give up, what you think's going on underfoot. Do you think that Sessions, if he appoints a special prosecutor on this Uranium One deal, I mean, might Mueller and Rosenstein and Hillary and all of her lieutenants, might they all go down with all this and with her private servers to cover the fact she was taking treasonous bribes through a global charity fraud? Might that all just implode?
Well, I think it might, but our history in this country is that generally these partisan hatreds that we have for each other, we don't take into legal matters and make prosecutions as we are doing now of the Donald Trump administration, which I think is a very partisan effort. Is Hillary vulnerable? Extremely vulnerable. Did she have confidential secret documents on her private server? Was she grossly negligent, which is a legal term? And should she have been prosecuted for that? I believe she should have been. Will she be, which is your question? Well, it remains to be seen whether the Justice Department will actually open an investigation of the current president's political opponent, which would smell to some people as a partisan effort. To perhaps you and I would think this is legitimate. I think they're going to think long and hard before they do that.
Last question, your Blood Feud book, which I brought up in the pre-interview. You had quote after quote, and I would play it back at the DVR. Hey, listen to this, honey, listen. I can't believe this. I said, I've never heard him back down on one quote. I've never heard anybody say I've never heard you make a single retraction in your books, and I don't think you have. So my question to you about Blood Feud, why is it that the Clintons and the Obamas, after well documented, I believe your book, I believe you had tons of documentation, why in the world did the Clintons and Obama end up working together with this uranium one deal when it was well documented they hated each other? Why did they do it? Why did the president approve it? Why did she take all this money? Why did they all keep quiet about it?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, this all happened while Hillary was Secretary of State under Barack Obama. Barack Obama and Hillary got along okay while she was Secretary of State. He never could stand Bill Clinton, and in fact, only invited the Clintons to dinner while he was president once during his entire 8 years.
Wow.
Whether he was complicit in this uranium one deal is hard to say, because the committee that approved it, there were 8 members of that committee. Hillary was one member. For all we know, this went through the White House without anybody blinking. I don't think that Barack Obama personally benefited in any kind of commercial or monetary way. But, he was a very weak president in foreign affairs. And Hillary had convinced him to do a reset with the Russians, as you remember.
Yep.
And so he went along with a lot of appeasing of the Russians and our other adversaries like Iran and North Korea. You can name a lot. And I think it was basically an incompetence more than anything else on his part.
If the sailing gets tough, the last question, if the sailing gets tough with Hillary Clinton, if she becomes under pressure and there's a special prosecutor and she's vulnerable, do you think the Obamas and the Clintons will turn on each other? Or do you think that nobody would get involved that deep, that hard if things happen?
Well, my sources tell me that Barack Obama is spending a lot of his time playing video games at home, talking to his celebrity friends on the phone like Jay-Z and Bruce Springsteen, and believe it or not, according to one person who was actually with him, smoking marijuana and popping cannabis-infused gummy bears. I think that ex-president of ours, Obama, has checked out. He's become the stoner ex-president. I don't think he's going to get himself involved very deeply. From time to time, he'll probably make a speech in favor of some Democratic candidate in 2018 and then go back to watching his video games.
Ed Klein dropped another bomb with your sources. I mean, you are a investigative reporter extraordinaire. The book, everybody should get it. I left out tons of stuff, folks. It's well indexed. Of course, you would. I mean, there's 30, 40 pages of just sourcing in the back of the book. It is a fabulous book, All Out War. It is the plot to destroy Donald Trump. It's not been out but just a couple of weeks. Ed Klein, thank you so much for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me.